Well, I want to begin this morning by thanking those of you who volunteered yesterday at our first, I never can remember what we're calling this, mobile food pantry here in Decatur. How many of you were there yesterday for that? Wow, it was such a great turnout by this church, and we were able to serve 109 families. This was the first time. It's going to increase from there. I especially want to thank Anna Coker for her vision in even bringing this about. But she has written a thank you note that I want to share with you. She says, "Dear Church of Christ family, Decatur Cares would like to extend its deepest heartfelt gratitude to all that assisted with the mobile food pantry yesterday. We fed 109 families, and you touched each one of them with your tireless work and generosity. Together we made a positive impact in these families' lives and demonstrated Christ-like living. Thank you, Decatur Cares." Then she put a P.S., and I love this. "We are so proud to be a part of this body, and together we set a high bar. Love all, Anna and Chad Coker." So thank you for your involvement in that, and it may be another 6 months or so, and hopefully we'll have another opportunity to help with that. Also, I want to remind you we have a blood drive next week. I only had 14 signed up last I looked. We need double that at least. Please go by and sign up today to give blood next week. You've been so good about doing that in the past, and I'd like for us to encourage reaching out to people in that way. So, Pierre-Jules Renard, who was a French author, once said, "There are moments when everything goes well. Don't be frightened. It won't last." Jewish writer Shalom Eliakim once described life as a blister on top of a tumor and a boil on top of that. American poet Carl Sandburg compared life to an onion. He said you peel off one layer at a time, and sometimes you weep. And Rick Maharis, you remember him? He was a really well-known NCAA basketball coach for years, had a really good personality, died just a few years ago. But he once said, "Everyone's worried about the economy this year. Hey, my hairline's in recession, my waistline's in inflation, and altogether I'm in depression." And some of us can relate to some of those statements, can't we? Especially if our eyes are fixed on life under the sun. So we're starting a new series today, and it's amazing the way this worship today has flowed so far. Now, I'll admit, Mark and I got together to discuss this week, and so Mark's tried to choose some songs that kind of go with that ebb and flow of our lives when we're up and when we're down. And then Caleb comes along, and Caleb, it's like you had notes from my sermon. You really laid some great foundation for Ecclesiastes, which is what we're going to begin studying today. And the verse you chose about being a living sacrifice, and then Mark turns around and sings a song, "And now we offer him our sacrifice." I mean, it's like we all got together to do this. I want you to know that's not the way it happened totally. It's just one of those great coincidences today. I'm going to be quoting from C.S. Lewis today quite a bit as well. But today we're beginning this new series that I've entitled The Search for Meaning. And it's a study of the book of Ecclesiastes. I want to share with you how I came to the decision to do this. I can't remember how long it was, Russ. You and I were talking one day after church. I don't even remember how the subject came up, but I said, "Man, Ecclesiastes is probably my least favorite book in the Bible." And Russ looked at me like I had just uttered the most awful words ever spoken. Russ said, "Hey, it's one of my favorite books." And so I got to thinking, hey, if Russ Hamilton likes this book that much, I need to dig back into it. And you know what? It's been very helpful to me. It's been very refreshing where I am in my faith journey to go back to this book again. And so if things don't go well with this study, blame Russ, okay? That's really why I told you all of that. Actually, Ecclesiastes take such a sober view of life that some people have doubted the spiritual value of it. To be honest, in the book we call the Bible, Ecclesiastes seems out of place. It seems out of step. Let me illustrate what I mean by that. And I'm going to use C.S. Lewis to illustrate a couple of things today. But C.S. Lewis didn't marry until late in life. And the lady he married had cancer, and she died just a few years after they married. And it threw him into a spiritual tailspin. And so he wrote this book called A Grief Observed. And when people who had been followers of Lewis's writings read this book, many of them were disappointed. They were troubled by what he wrote because Lewis had been their champion. Lewis had been this great apologist. You know, that doesn't mean you make an apology in the sense we think. It means you defend the faith, and he was this great defender of the faith, and he strengthened and bolstered people's faith through his writings. And suddenly, here they are reading words about doubts that he's having and questions that he has of God. Words like these that come from his book. He said, it doesn't really matter whether you grip the arms of the dentist chair or let your hands lie in your lap. The drill drills on. Another place he wrote, meanwhile, where is God? Go to him when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain, and what do you find? A door slammed in your face, a sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside, and after that, silence. You may as well turn away. The longer you wait, the more emphatic the silence will become. His readers didn't expect that kind of language from him. But many of you here know that that's an accurate description of what it sometimes is like as you journey through the pains of grief. So, when it comes to Scripture, many people have expressed a similar unsettling, a similar reaction to Ecclesiastes. Here you have this body of writings, like C.S. Lewis's body of writings, and then he has this exception, and you got this body of writings, and then you've got Ecclesiastes. We're not ready for the words that we find there because we've come to accept Scripture what we've come to accept Scripture to say doesn't match up with it. The words disturb us. They raise questions that we would rather sweep under the carpet. They raise questions that we would rather ignore. Or even worse, maybe, that we sugarcoat. Ecclesiastes confronts us with the tough issues like the problem of evil, the injustices in life, the unfairness of life. And it attempts to answer several basic questions, but one of the basic questions it attempts to answer is this: how can we live by faith in a world that simply won't behave? These questions have puzzled theologians and philosophers for thousands of years, but these are questions that puzzle us sometimes too, right? Are you with me? So as we begin this journey, we first need to get acquainted with our tour guide. He introduces himself in the very first verse when he says the words of the teacher, and I really like the translations that say preacher better than this because, hey, that's me. The words of the preacher, son of David, king of Jerusalem. I want you to know this, that nowhere in this book does he give his name. Now, traditionally, we've credited this book to Solomon, and there's good reasons for that. Who else could fulfill what it says down in verse 17 or 16 when he said, I said to myself, Look, I've increased in wisdom more than anyone who has ruled over Jerusalem before me. I've experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. And Solomon was the son of David, which is the way that he introduced the letter. And further, there is strong similarity to the way this book begins and the way Proverbs begins. Look at these two as I put them side by side. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. The words of the teacher, son of David, king of Jerusalem. And so there are good reasons for us to assume that it was Solomon that wrote this letter. But since he doesn't mention himself by name, a number of scholars have said, well, the timing and all really doesn't fit Solomon. They say the term son of David doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be a literal son of David, because Joseph, the stepfather of Jesus, he's called in Matthew chapter 1 and verse 20 the son of David. Jesus himself took that title as a messianic title, right? The son of David. And they say that the Hebrew that is used in Ecclesiastes is a Hebrew that was not used in 1000 BC when Solomon was alive. So, strictly speaking, we must say that this book is anonymous. We cannot with complete certainty identify the preacher. It's someone who had time, who had money, who had opportunity, and who had energy to search for answers to these deep questions, many of which go along this line. Is life worth living? For our study, I'll tell you this. I'm going to refer to him either as the preacher or as Solomon, because I lean toward it being Solomon who wrote Ecclesiastes. But again, I just want you to know that we cannot say that with absolute certainty. So this preacher steps into his pulpit, and he unsettles us all by just shouting these words found in verse 2. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. Boy, that's Zig Ziglar for you, isn't it? You know what? You won't ever find Joel Osteen using this for one of his texts. The word meaningless is found 38 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. So it's very central to what he's trying to get across. And it is the Hebrew word hevel. And here's how hevel is described in ancient literature. Whatever is left after you break a soap bubble. Whatever is left after you break a soap bubble. That's meaningless. And let's be honest, most of us have not encountered this kind of preaching before. In fact, most of us don't have much background in hearing preaching from the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. It's different for us. It's like an American going to Australia. And you've got to realize, you've got to reframe everything as you're now driving on the left side of the road rather than the right. And so your perspective is different. And we've got to do that when we go to this Old Testament wisdom literature. It reads differently. Most of us have grown up traveling the Pauline highway of the New Testament or the gospel highway of the New Testament. We're not used to this wisdom literature. It's less traveled by us. And so Psalms is kind of like driving an old country road, most of the time. It's really cool until you come to those Psalms that you want to edit or rewrite that are just all about raw emotion. And the Songs of Solomon, that's like traveling in the red light district of a place, and you're going, should I really even be going here? And then you've got Job. Job's like taking a road that's just a long stretch of desert highway. with no light, no gas stations, no rest stops for miles. And, people get stranded out there. Nobody to help them. So we don't travel the Job road much either. In Ecclesiastes, well, that's like when you go downtown and there's that guy standing on the corner who's glaring at you and he's yelling things about how our lives are all built on illusions, and he keeps reminding us of the inevitability of death. And it's that guy that you're uncomfortable with, so you cross the road and go down the other side of the street. Well, another book that's attributed to Solomon is the book of Proverbs. And Proverbs is a book that focuses on norms. It focuses on rules, on general truths. So he wrote Proverbs, and then you've got Ecclesiastes, and they're almost like mirror images of each other. Because Ecclesiastes focuses not on the rules, it focuses on the exceptions to the rules. We need to understand that as we read it. Think back to when you were in school. For some of us, this is getting harder all the time. But think back to when you were in school. Didn't you hate learning about exceptions to the rule? Because exceptions to the rule are harder to learn than the rules. Let me give you an example. Remember when you were learning grammar and the teacher told you I before E? Wow, that's a good rule, I before E. In fact, that really helps me when I'm learning how to spell words like believe. And just about the time you think that you've got a grasp on I before E, the teacher steps in and says, you know what, that rule doesn't always work. There's exceptions to the rule, I before E except after C, and any word that has the sound of A, like neighbor and way. What? And what it does is it complicates grammar, and yet at the same time, if you don't learn the exceptions to the rule, you'll never be able to spell properly either. And that's the way it is with life. And that's the way it is in Ecclesiastes. You see, Scripture needs Ecclesiastes to keep you and me from settling for the idea that life is just lived by a formula as we live this life under the sun. Let me give you an example. Proverbs 13 and verse 21 says this: trouble pursues the sinner, but the righteous are rewarded with good things. Remember, Proverbs are general truths. This is often the case, isn't it? In fact, all of us would say, that's the way it ought to be. That's the way the world ought to operate. The bad ought to be punished, the good ought to be rewarded. Well, if that were true, Job's friends were right in the accusations they brought against Job. Because they said, Job, fess up, man. You got a sin in your life that you're not admitting to, and until you do that, God's not going to bless you. And then the preacher comes along and says in Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 15, in this meaningless life of mine, I've seen both of these, the righteous perishing in their righteousness and the wicked living long in their wickedness. Oh, now we've got some exceptions to the rule, don't we? Because we've all seen this too, haven't we? It's not what we want, but it's the way life is under the sun. Because you see, at the very beginning of Job, we're told that Job was a righteous man. But in his experiences, they didn't correspond with this standard, trite truth that his friends were trying to bring against him. It's as if Job's friends knew the proverbial I before E, but they didn't know that there were exceptions to the rule, except before C or any word with A that sounds like neighbor and way. And as a result, they misapplied this general rule and they damaged their friend. They damaged their neighbor rather than loving him. And they did it all misguidedly in the name of God. Jesus' disciples weren't any different. One day Jesus was in the temple, and as he finished what he was saying there, they wanted to stone him to death, so he leaves the temple, and as he's leaving, there's a blind man sitting just outside the temple, John chapter 9, verse 1. And the disciples turned to him and they asked Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? That's the general rule that we just read about in Proverbs pretty much, isn't it? But Jesus said, no, you don't get it. And he went on to explain to them a better perspective. And you see, that's what Ecclesiastes does for us. Ecclesiastes offers this same kind of an exception voice to remind us that we can't hand out a one-size-fits-all for every person's problems, every person's troubles, every person's struggles. You can't do it. Because life under the sun is messy. Why is it messy, this life under the sun? Because of flawed human beings living in a broken world. That's why. So the preacher describes life as it actually presents itself. And if someone would have said to him, you shouldn't be talking about things like this in church, he would have said, but people in church are already experiencing it. And if someone would have said, well, the things you're talking about shouldn't happen, he would have said, yeah, but they do happen. So now what do we do about it? And don't make the mistake of thinking that because this was written 3,000 years ago that it is not relevant today. Ecclesiastes reads like this morning's headlines. Disaster in London yesterday, the tragic terrorist attack. Injustices in our world. Crooked politics. Incompetent leaders. Materialism. A sentimental longing for the good old days. That's Ecclesiastes. And so why should we study this book? Well, first of all, it helps us ask the bigger, harder questions that, quite frankly, people are wanting to talk about today. They're already asking these questions. Questions that lie at the very heart of life in a fallen world. The preacher, like me, he's not satisfied with some of the answers that he was given as a child when it came to his faith. He's begun to question some of those things. In fact, part of his spiritual struggle seems to be that it's with those pat answers that he had always been given. And so if you're a person who often finds yourself when someone says something going, yeah, but how about when blank? Ecclesiastes is for you, man. Second, it helps us to worship the one true God. Because for all of the doubts that it speaks of and all of the dissatisfaction that it talks about, Ecclesiastes teaches us great things about God. It presents God as mighty creator and sovereign Lord and powerful ruler of the universe and the only wise God. And third, it helps us live for God and not for ourselves. Oh, this is really important. Because you see, Solomon had more money and enjoyed more pleasures and possessed more wisdom than anybody who had lived up to that time. The reason I say up to that time is there are richer people now than Solomon was. And yet all of what he looked at and longed for ended in despair. Having it all nearly destroyed him. I love the way the Old Testament scholar Sandra Richter explains this. Listen closely to her words. She said, when he climbs the golden ladder of ultimate success and looks over the brink, he actually has the wherewithal to step back from the edge, climb back down, and tell the rest of us that there's nothing up there. He seems to be saying, let me spare you making the same mistakes I did. Learn from an expert like me. And fourth, it helps us to be honest about the troubles of life. This is vital. This is vital because I know so many people who have walked away from faith because they cannot handle the trite, simplistic things that some people have said to them. We need a balance of Ecclesiastes in our theology. Because Ecclesiastes captures the futility and the frustration of a fallen world. It talks about the drudgery of work, and it talks about the emptiness of foolish pleasure, and it talks about the mind-numbing tedium of daily life. And reading Ecclesiastes helps us to be honest to God with questions we have. One scholar put it this way. He said Ecclesiastes is kind of like a back door that allows believers to have the sad and skeptical thoughts that they would never allow to enter the front door of their faith. Because regardless of what the health and wealth folks tell you, and Beverly said, you need to explain to people what you mean by health and wealth. I'll tell you what, you come back 1 o'clock today, we'll talk more about that when we meet together in the family room. I'll give you opportunity to share on that. But there is this gospel out there, this health and wealth gospel, and regardless of what they tell you, I want you to know this. Life is filled with inequality. Life can be just as problematic for a believer, maybe even more so at times than for an unbeliever. And even those of us who believe in God don't end up with all the answers. In fact, I have found that the deeper I dive, oftentimes the more puzzled I end up. And so back to C.S. Lewis. In this time of grief in his life, he wrestled with two seeming contradictions. The first was that when it came to the felt presence of God. And Lewis wrote in that book, A Grief Observed, "Not that I am, I think, in much danger of ceasing to believe in God. The real danger is of coming to believe such dreadful things about Him. The conclusion I dread is not so there's no God after all, but so this is what God's really like." Now he comes to a different conclusion at the end of his book, but that's pretty raw, isn't it? And the second thing that Lewis wrestles with in his book has to do with the presence of God that comes in a way that we don't understand to deal with something in our lives that we do not even realize yet. And so early in his book, he described God as silent and behind this double locked door. But by the end of his book, he says this: it's more like a silent, certainly not uncompassionate gaze. As though he shook his head not in refusal, but waiving the question. It was like, "Peace, child. You don't understand." And as I look through Ecclesiastes, I feel like Solomon had a similar journey. For much of this book, he's questioning things about God. He's questioning how to deal with life. But by the end, he comes to this settled place. A settled place where he's satisfied to know he can't understand it all, but there's a God who does. And he makes a case for us to recover what is truly good. In fact, in my rereading of Ecclesiastes, this has probably stood out to me more than anything. Basically, because Solomon, and we'll talk more about that in future weeks, but you know, the Epicureans had this saying, and you all are aware of it: eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. They were very fatalistic in why they believed that. Hey, life holds out nothing, so you might as well enjoy the moment. Solomon comes to a similar conclusion, but it's got a different spin on it. His is keep an eternal perspective, and as long as you keep an eternal perspective, hey, can I tell you what? The richest way to live is enjoy the moment. Be satisfied and settled in the moment. Oh, he's still, as he goes through this book, he's still listening to answers for his questions on the other side of that locked door. But through it all, as much as this book seems like it's cynical and pessimistic, it ends up so hopeful. Enjoy this moment you've been given in your life under the sun. Because, you see, the truth of the matter is, the good life exists only when we stop obsessing about a better one. And it's a condition of savoring what is, rather than constantly longing for what might be. And I love that. So are you ready for this journey through the summer? I hope you are. And I hope you'll come and be a part of us discussing it together at 1 o'clock as well. But what I want to leave you with today is that Solomon's conclusion is the only way we can find fulfillment in life is by God filling our emptiness. It's about being filled with Him. And so, if you've never accepted Jesus in your life, you've got a vacuum there that nothing else can fill. And we want to encourage you to come and receive Him as your Lord and Savior and be baptized today. We will have an elder and his wife in room 102. If there's something that you need to share in a private way, and let them pray with you, or you can come today and express any prayer needs you might have before the body right now as we encourage you through this song that's selected for this reason. Let's stand and sing.
Of the shadow of death, your perfect love is casting out fear. And even when I'm caught in the middle of the storms of this life, I won't turn back, I know you are near. And I will fear no evil, for